The Secret Doctrine by Elena Petrovna Blavatsky, a facsimile of the original edition of 1888, printed by the Cunningham Press, Alhambra, California. Book 2, Part 1, Anthropogenesis, stanzas translated with commentaries, from the Secret Book of John. Stanza 3, Attempts to create man. Verse 11, The Lord of the Lords came. From her body he separated the waters, and that was heaven above the first heaven, the atmosphere or the air, the firmament. Here tradition falls again into the universal. As in the earliest version repeated in the Puranas, so in the latest, the Mosaic account. In the first it is said, He, the Lord, the God who has the form of Brahma, when the world had become one ocean, Harivamsa 1:36, concluding that within the waters lay the earth, and desirous to raise it up, to separate it, create himself in another form. As in the preceding Kalpa, Manvantara, he had assumed the shape of a tortoise, so in this one he took the shape of a boar, etc., etc. In the Elohistic creation, Genesis verses 6, 7, 8, and 9, God creates a firmament in the midst of the waters and says, Let dry land appear. And now comes the traditional peg whereunto is hung the esoteric portion of the Kabbalistic interpretation. Verse 12. The great Kochans, lords, called the lords of the moon of the airy bodies. Who are the lords of the moon? In India they are called Pitris or lunar ancestors, but in the Hebrew scrolls it is Jehovah himself who is the lord of the moon, collectively as the host and also as one of the Elohim. The astronomy of the Hebrews and their observance of times was regulated by the moon. A Kabbalist having shown that Daniel told of God's providence by set times, and that the revelation of John speaks of a carefully measured cubical city descending out of the heavens, etc., adds, quote, But the vitalizing power of heaven lay chiefly with the moon. It was the Hebrew Yahweh, Jehovah, and St. Paul's enjoins, Let no man judge you for your observance of the seventh day, and the day of the new moon, which are a shadow of things to come. But the body or substance is of Christ, or Jehovah, that function of this power that made the barren woman a mother, for they are the gift of Jehovah, unquote, which is a key to the objection which her husband made to the Shunammite, as to her going to the man of God. Quote, For it is neither the seventh day nor the day of the new moon, unquote. 2 Kings 4:23. The living spiritual powers of the constellations had mighty wars, marked by the movements and positions of the stars and planets, and especially as the result of the conjunction of the moon, earth, and sun. Bentley comments on the Hindu war between the gods and the giants, as marked by the eclipse of the sun at the ascending node of the moon, 945 before Christ, with in brackets double exclamation mark, at which time was born, or produced from the sea, Shri, Sarai, S-R-I, the wife of the Hebrew Abram. Note, according to the wonderful chronology of Bentley, who wrote in days when biblical chronology was still on dispute, and also according to that of those modern Orientalists who dwarf the Hindu dates as far as they can. And note, now Shri is the daughter of Brigu, one of the Prajapatis and Rishis, the chief of the Brigus, the consumers, the aerial class of gods. She is Lakshmi, the wife of Vishnu, and she is the bride of Shiva, Gauri, and she is Saraswati, the watery, the wife of Brahma, because the three gods and goddesses are one under three aspects. Read the explanation of Parasara in Vishnu Purana in Book 1, Chapter 8, Volume 1, Wilson's translation, page 119, and you will understand. The Lord of Shri is the moon, he says, and Shri is the wife of Narayana, the god of gods. Shri or Lakshmi, Venus, is Indrani, as she is Saraswati, for in the words of Parasara, Hari or Ishvara, the Lord, is all that is called male in the universe. Lakshmi is all that is termed female. There is nothing else than they. Hence she is female, and God is male nature. End of notes. Shri is also Venus Aphrodite, the western emblem of the lunisolar year or the moon, as Shri is the wife of the moon, vide footnote, the goddess of increase. Note, Shri is goddess of and herself fortune and prosperity. End of note. Therefore, the grand monument and landmark of the exact period of the lunar year and month by which this cycle of 19 tropical years and 235 revolutions of the moon could be calculated was Mount Sinai, the Lord Jehovah coming down thereon. Paul speaks then as a mystagogue when he says concerning the freed woman and bondwoman of Abraham, "For this Hagar, the bondwoman, is Mount Sinai in Arabia." How could a woman be a mountain, and such a mountain? Yet she was. Her name was Hagar, whose Hebrew numbers reread 235, or in exact measure the very number of lunar months to equal 19 tropical years to complete this cycle. Mount Sinai being the esoteric language of the wisdom, the monument of the exact time of the lunar years and months by which this spiritual vitalizing circle could be computed, and which mountain indeed was called the mountain of the moon, Sin. So also Sarai, Shri, the wife of Abram, could have no child until her name was changed to Sarah, giving to her the property of this lunar influence. Note: Masonic Review, Cincinnati, June 1886, article The Kabbalah, end of note. This may be regarded as a digression from the main subject, but it is a very necessary one with a view to Christian readers. For who, after studying dispassionately the respective legends of Abram or Abraham, Sarai or Sarah, who was fair to look upon, and those of Brahma and Saraswati, or Shri, Lakshmi Venus, with the relations of all these to the moon and water, and especially one who understands the real Kabbalistic meaning of the name Jehovah and its relation to and connection with the moon, who can doubt that the story of Abram is based upon that of Brahma, or that Genesis was written upon the old lines used by every ancient nation? All in the ancient scriptures is allegorical, all based upon and inseparably connected with astronomy and cosmology. Verse 13. They, the moon gods, went, each on his allotted land, 7 of them, each on his lot. The lords of the flame remained behind. They would not go. They would not create. The secret teachings show the divine progenitors creating men on 7 portions of the globe, each on his lot, that is, each a different race of men externally and internally, and on different zones. This polygenistic claim is considered elsewhere, vide Stanza 7. But who are they who create, and the lords of the flame who do not? Occultism divides the creators into 12 classes, of which 4 have reached liberation to the end of the Great Age. The 5th is ready to reach it, but still remains active on the intellectual planes, while 7 are still under direct karmic law. These last act on the man-bearing globes of our chain. Exoteric Hindu books mention 7 classes of Pitris, and among them 2 distinct kinds of progenitors or ancestors, the Barishad and the Agnishvata, or those possessed of the sacred fire, and those devoid of it. Hindu ritualism seems to connect them with sacrificial fires, and with Grihastha Brahmins in early incarnations, those who have and those who have not attended as they should to their household sacred fires in their previous births. The distinction, as said, is derived from the Vedas. The first and highest class, esoterically, the Agnishvata, are represented in the exoteric allegory as Grihastha, Brahman householders, who in their past births in other manvantaras, having failed to maintain their domestic fires and to offer burnt sacrifices, have lost every right to have oblations with fire presented to them. Whereas the Barishad, being Brahmins who have kept up the household sacred fires, are thus honored to this day. Thence the Agnishvata are represented as devoid of, and the Barishad are possessed of, fires. But esoteric philosophy explains the original qualifications as being due to the difference between the natures of the 2 classes. The Agnishvata Pitris are devoid of fire, that is, of creative passion, because too divine and pure, vide Supra, Sloka 11th. Whereas the Barishad, being the lunar spirits more closely connected with earth, became the creative Elohim of form, or the atom of dust. The allegory says that Sanandana and other Vedas, the sons of Brahma, his first progeny, were without desire or passion, inspired with the holy wisdom, estranged from the universe and undesirous of progeny. Vishnu Purana, Book 1, 7. This also is what is meant in Sloka 11 by the words, "they would not create," and is explained as follows. The primordial emanations from the creative power are too near the absolute cause. They are transitional and latent forces, which will develop only in the next and subsequent removes. This makes it plain. Hence Brahma is said to have felt wrathful when he saw that those embodied spirits produced from his limbs, Gatra, would not multiply themselves, after which in the allegory he creates other 7 mind-born sons. See Mokshadharma and Mahabharata, namely Mariki, Atri, Angras, Pulastya, Pula, Kratu, and Vashita, the latter being often replaced by Daksha, the most prolific of the creators. In most of the texts, these 7 sons of Vashishta Daksha are called the 7 rishis of the 3rd Manvantara, the latter referring both to the 3rd round and also to the 3rd root race and its branch races in the 4th round. These are all the creators of the various beings on this earth, the Prajapati, and at the same time they appear as diverse reincarnations in the early Manvantaras or races. It thus becomes clear why the Agnishvata, devoid of the grosser creative fire, hence unable to create physical man, having no double or astral body to protect, since they were without any form, are shown in exoteric allegories as yogis, kumaras, chaste youths, who became rebels, asuras, fighting and opposing gods, etc., etc. Note, because, as the allegory shows, the gods who had no personal merit of their own, dreading the sanctity of those self-striving incarnated beings who had become ascetics and yogis, and thus threatened to upset the power of the former by their self-acquired powers, denounced them. All this has a deep philosophical meaning and refers to the evolution and acquirement of divine powers through self-exertion. Some rishi yogis are shown in the Puranas to be far more powerful than the gods. Secondary gods or temporary powers in nature, the forces, are doomed to disappear. It is only the spiritual potentiality in man which can lead him to become one with the infinite and the absolute. End of note. Yet it is they alone who could complete man, that is, make of him a self-conscious, almost a divine being, a god on earth. The Parishad, though possessed of creative fire, were devoid of the higher Mahatmic element. Being on a level with the lower principles, those which precede gross objective matter, they could only give birth to the outer man, or rather to the model of the physical, the astral man. Thus, though we see them entrusted with the task by Brahma, the collective Mahat or universal divine mind, the mystery of creation is repeated on earth, only in an inverted sense, as in a mirror. It is those who are unable to create the spiritual immortal man who project the senseless model, the astral, of the physical being, and, as will be seen, it was those who would not multiply who sacrificed themselves to the good and salvation of spiritual humanity. For to complete the septenary man, to add to his 3 lower principles and ciment them with the spiritual monad, which could never dwell in such a form otherwise than in an absolutely latent state, 2 connecting principles are needed, manas and karma. This requires a living spiritual fire of the middle principle from the 5th and 3rd states of pleroma. But this fire is the possession of the triangles, not of the perfect cubes, which symbolize the angelic beings, the former having from the first creation got hold of it and being said to have appropriated it for themselves, as in the allegory of Prometheus. These are the active and therefore in heaven no longer pure beings. Note, see Book 1, stanza 3-5. The triangle becomes a pentagon, 5-fold, on earth. End of note. They have become the independent and free intelligences, shown in every theogony as fighting for that independence and freedom, and hence, in the ordinary sense, rebellious to the divine passive law. These are then those flames, the Agnishvata, who, as shown in Sloka 13, remain behind instead of going along with the others to create men on earth. But the true esoteric meaning is that most of them were destined to incarnate as the egos of the forthcoming crop of mankind. The human ego is neither Atman nor Buddhi, but the higher manas, the intellectual fruition and the efflorescence of the intellectual self-conscious egotism in the higher spiritual sense. The ancient works refer to it as Karana Sarira on the plane of Sutratma, which is the golden thread on which, like beads, the various personalities of this high ego are strung. If the reader were told, as in the semi-esoteric allegories, that these beings were returning nirvanis from preceding Mahamanvantaras, ages of incalculable duration, which have rolled away in the eternity, a still more incalculable time ago, he would hardly understand the text correctly, while some Vedantins might say, "This is not so. The Nirvani can never return," which is true during the Manvantara he belongs to, and erroneous where eternity is concerned. For it is said in the sacred slokas, "The thread of radiance, which is imperishable and dissolves only in Nirvana, re-emerges from it in its integrity on the day when the great law calls all things back into action." Hence, as the high Pitris or Dhyanis had no hand in the physical creation, we find primeval man issued from the bodies of his spiritually fireless progenitors, described as aeriform, devoid of compactness and mindless. He had no middle principle to serve him as a medium between the highest and the lowest, the spiritual man and the physical brain, for he lacked manas. The monads which incarnated in those empty shells remained as unconscious as when separated from their previous incomplete forms and vehicles. There is no potentiality for the creation or self-consciousness in a pure spirit on this our plane, unless it's too homogeneous perfect, because divine nature is, so to say, mixed with and strengthened by an essence already differentiated. It is only the lower line of the triangle, representing the first triad that emanates from the universal monad, that can furnish this needed consciousness on the plane of differentiated nature. But how could these pure emanations, which, on this principle, must have originally been themselves unconscious, in our sense, be of any use in supplying the required principle, as they could hardly have possessed it themselves? The answer is difficult to comprehend unless one is well acquainted with the philosophical metaphysics of a beginningless and endless series of cosmic rebirths, and becomes well impressed and familiarized with that immutable law of nature which is eternal motion, cyclic and spiral, therefore progressive even in its seeming retrogression. The one divine principle, the nameless that of the Vedas, is the universal total which, neither in its spiritual aspect and emanations, nor in its physical atoms, can ever be at absolute rest except during the nights of Brahma. Hence also the firstborn are those who are first set in motion at the beginning of a manvantara, and thus the first to fall into the lower spheres of materiality. They who are called in theology the thrones, and are the seat of God, must be the first incarnated men on earth, and it becomes comprehensible if we think of the endless series of past manvantaras to find that the last had to come first, and the first last. We find, in short, that the higher angels had broken countless aeons before, through the 7 circles, and thus robbed them of the sacred fire, which means, in plain words, they had assimilated during their past incarnations in lower as well as in higher worlds all the wisdom therefrom, the reflection of Mahat in its various degrees of intensity. No entity, whether angelic or human, can reach the state of nirvana, of absolute purity, except through aeons of suffering and the knowledge of evil as well as of good, as otherwise the latter remains incomprehensible. Between man and the animal, whose monads or jivas are fundamentally identical, there is the impassable abyss of mentality and self-consciousness. What is human mind in its higher aspect? Whence comes it, if it is not a portion of the essence? And in some rare cases of incarnation, the very essence of a higher being, one from a higher and divine plane. Can man, a god in the animal form, be the product of material nature by evolution alone, even as is the animal which differs from man in external shape, but by no means in the materials of its physical fabric, and is informed by the same though undeveloped monad, seeing that the intellectual potentialities of the two differ as the sun does from the glowworm. And what is it that creates such difference, unless man is an animal plus a living God within his physical shell? Let us pause and ask ourselves seriously the question, regardless of the vagaries and sophisms of both the materialistic and the physiological modern sciences. To some extent it is admitted that even the esoteric teaching is allegorical. To make the latter comprehensible to the average intelligence requires the use of symbols cast in an intelligible form. Hence the allegorical and semi-mythical narratives of the exoteric and the only semi-metaphysical and objective representations in the esoteric teachings. For the purely and transcendentally spiritual conceptions are adaptable only to the perceptions of those who see without eyes, hear without ears, and sense without organs, according to the graphic expression of the commentary. The too Puritan idealist is at liberty to spiritualize the tenet, whereas the modern psychologist would simply try to spirit away our fallen, yet still divine, human soul in its connection with Buddhi. The mystery attached to the highly spiritual ancestors of the divine man within the earthly man is very great. His dual creation is hinted at in the Puranas, though its esoteric meaning can be approached only by collating together the many varying accounts and reading them in their symbolical and allegorical character. So it is in the Bible, both in Genesis and even in the epistles of Paul. For that Creator, who is called in the 2nd chapter of Genesis the Lord God, is in the original the Elohim, or gods, the lords, in the plural, and while one of them makes the earthly Adam of dust, the other breathes into him the breath of life, and the third makes of him a living soul. Chapter 2, verse 7. All of which readings are implied in the plural number of the Elohim. Note, Seth, as Bunsen and others have shown, is not only the primitive god of the Semites, early Jews included, but also their semi-divine ancestor. For, says Bunsen, in God in History, Volume 1, pages 233 and 234, the Seth of Genesis, the father of Enoch, the man, must be considered as originally running parallel with that derived from the Elohim, Adam's father. According to Bunsen, the deity, the god Seth, was the primitive god of northern Egypt and Palestine, from Stanislav Wake, the Great Pyramid. And Seth became considered in the later theology of the Egyptians as an evil daemon, says the same Bunsen, for he is one with the Typhon and one with the Hindu demons as a logical sequel. End of note. The first man is of the earth, the second, the last, or rather highest, is from heaven, says Paul in the first book of Corinthians, chapter 15, verse 47. In the Aryan allegory, the rebellious sons of Brahma are all represented as holy ascetics and yogis. Reborn in every kalpa, they generally try to impede the work of human procreation. When Daksha, the chief of the Prajapati creators, brings forth 10,000 sons for the purpose of peopling the world, Narada, a son of Brahma, the great rishi, and virtually a Kumara, if not so in name, interferes with and twice frustrates Daksha's aim by persuading those sons to remain holy ascetics and eschew marriage. For this, Daksha curses Narada to be reborn as a man, as Brahma had cursed him before for refusing to marry and obtain progeny, saying, "Perish in thy present, deva or angelic form, and take up thy abode in the womb." That is, become a man. Vayu Purana, Harivamsa 170. Notwithstanding several conflicting versions of the same story, it is easy to see that Narada belongs to that class of Brahmas, firstborn, who have all proven rebellious to the law of animal procreation for which they had to incarnate as men. Of all the Vedic rishis, Narada, as already shown, is the most incomprehensible because the most closely connected with the occult doctrines, especially with the secret cycles and kalpas. Vide super. Certain contradictory statements about this sage have much distracted the Orientalists. Thus he is shown as refusing positively to create, have progeny, and even as calling his father Brahma a false teacher for advising him to get married. Narada Pankaratra. Nevertheless, he is referred to as one of the Prajapati progenitors. In Naradya Purana, he describes the laws and the duties of the celibate adepts, and as these occult duties did not happen to be found in the fragment of about 3,000 stanzas in the possession of European museums, the Brahmins are proclaimed liars, the Orientalists forgetting that the Naradya is credited with containing 25,000 stanzas, and that it is not very likely that such manuscripts should be found in the hands of the Hindu profane, those who are ready to sell any precious olla for a red pottage. Suffice it to say that Narada is the Devarishi of occultism par excellence, and that the occultist who does not ponder, analyze, and study Narada from his 7 esoteric facets will never be able to fathom certain anthropological, chronological, and even cosmic mysteries. He is one of the fires above mentioned, and plays a part in the evolution of this kalpa from its incipient down to its final stage. He is an actor who appears in each of the successive acts, root races, of the present Manvantaric drama, in the world allegories which strike the keynote of esotericism and are now becoming more familiar to the reader. But shall we turn to other ancient scriptures and documents for the corroboration of the fires, sparks, and flames? They are plentiful, if one only seeks for them in the right places. In the book of the Concealed Mystery they are clearly enunciated, as also in the Hydra Zuta Kadisha, or the Lesser Holy Assembly. The language is very mystical and veiled, yet still comprehensible. Therein, among the sparks of prior worlds, vibrating flames and sparks from the divine flint, the workmen proceed to create man, male and female, 427, which flames and sparks, angels and their worlds, stars and planets, are said figuratively to become extinct and die, that is to say, remain unmanifested until a certain process of nature is accomplished. To show how thickly veiled from public view are the most important facts of Anthropogenesis, 2 passages are now quoted from 2 Kabbalistic books. The first is from the book of the Concealed Mystery, 429. From a light-bearer, one of the 7 sacred planets, of insupportable brightness proceeded a radiating flame, dashing off, like a vast and mighty hammer, those sparks which were the prior worlds. 430. And with most subtle ether were these intermingled and bound mutually together, but only when they were conjoined together, even the Great Father and Great Mother. 431. From Hua himself is Ab, the Father, and from Hua himself is Ruach, the Spirit, who are hidden in the Ancient of Days, and therein is that ether concealed. 432. And it was connected with a light-bearer, a planet, and its angel or regent, which went forth from that light-bearer in insupportable brightness, which is hidden in the bosom of Aima, the Great Mother. Note. See Mr. Mather's Kabbalah Unveiled. End of note. Now the following extract from the Zohar also deals with the same mystery, translated in Aymaya's Kabbalah. The pre-Adamite kings, we have learned in the Sephirad Tzaniuta that the Attika, Datikin, ancient of ancients, before he prepared his form, built kings, and engraved kings, and sketched out kings, men, the kings of the animals. And they could not exist till he overthrew them, and hid them until after a time. Therefore it is written, And these are the kings which reigned in the land of Edom, and they could not exist till Reshahivra, the Whitehead, the Attika Datikin, ancient of ancients, arranged himself, and formed all forms above and below. Before he arranged himself in his form had not been formed all those whom he decided to form, and all worlds have been destroyed. They did not remain in their places, because the form of the kings had not been formed as it ought to be, and the holy city had not been prepared. Soha 3, 135a, 292a, Idra Zutta, Brody, etc. Now the plain meaning of these 2 allegorical and metaphysical disquisitions is simply this. Worlds and men were in turn formed and destroyed under the law of evolution and from pre-existing material, until both the planets and their men, in our case our Earth and its animal and human races, became what they are now in the present cycle, opposite polar forces, an equilibrized compound of spirit and matter, of the positive and the negative, of the male and the female. Before man could become male and female physically, his prototype, the creating Elohim, had to arrange his form on this sexual plane astrally. That is to say, the atoms and the organic forces descending into the plane of the given differentiation had to be marshaled in the order intended by nature, so as to be ever carrying out in an immaculate way that law which the Kabbalah calls the balance, through which everything that exists does so as male and female in its final perfection in this present stage of materiality. Klokhma, wisdom, the male Sephiroth, had to diffuse itself in and through Bina, intelligent nature, or understanding. Therefore the first root race of men, sexless and mindless, had to be overthrown and hidden until after a time, that is, the first race, instead of dying, disappeared in the second race, as certain lower lives and plants do in their progeny. It was a wholesale transformation. The first became the second root race, without either begetting it, procreating it, or dying. They passed by together, as it is written, and he died, and another reigned in his stead. Genesis 26:31 et sequens, Zohar 3:292a. Why? Because the holy city had not been prepared. And what is the holy city? The makwam, the secret place or the shrine on earth. In other words, the human womb, the microscopic copy and reflection of the heavenly matrix, the female space or primeval chaos, in which the male spirit fecundates the germ of the sun or the visible universe. Vide the Holy of Holies, its esoteric meaning in part 2 of this volume. So much so that in the paragraph on the emanation of the male and female principle in the Zohar, it is said that on this earth the wisdom from the holy ancient does not shine except in male and female. Chokhmah, wisdom, is the father, and Bina, understanding, is the mother. And when they connect one with the other, they bring forth and diffuse and emanate truth. In the sayings of Rabbi Jeyeva Saba, that is, the old, we learned this. What is Bina, understanding? But when they connect in one another, the Yod, in the year, they become impregnated and produce a son, and therefore it is called Bina, understanding. It means Binya, that is, son of Yah. This is the completeness of the whole. Note, Zohar 3:290a, quoted in Isaac Mayer's Kabbalah, page 387. End of note. This is also the completeness of phallicism by the rabbis, its perfect apotheosis, the divine being dragged into the animal, the sublime into the grossness of the terrestrial. Nothing so graphically gross exists in Eastern occultism, nor in the primitive Kabbalah, the Chaldean Book of Numbers. We have said so in Isis Unveiled. We find it rather unwise on the part of Catholic writers to pour out their vials of wrath in such sentences as these. In a multitude of pagodas, the phallic stone, ever and always assuming, like the Grecian Batilos, the brutally indecent form of the Lingam, the Mahadeva. Before casting slurs on a symbol whose profound metaphysical meaning is too much for the modern champions of that religion of sensualism par excellence, Roman Catholicism, to grasp, they are in duty bound to destroy their oldest churches and change the form of the cupolas of their own temples. The Mahoda of Elephanta, the round tower of Bangulpur, the minarets of Islam, either rounded or pointed, are the originals of the campanile columns of San Marco at Venice, of the rustic cathedral, and of the modern Duomo of Milan. All of these steeples, turrets, domes, and Christian temples are the reproductions of the primitive idea of the lithos, the upright phallus. Volume 2, page 5. Nevertheless, and however it may be, the fact that all these Hebrew Elohim, sparks, and cherubs are identical with the Devas, Rishis, and the fires and flames, the Rudras, and the 49 Agnis of the ancient areas, is sufficiently proven by and in the Kabbalah.